Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online briefing on law disorder on the streets of London. My name is Emma Webb. I'm the director of the Common Sense Society UK. And if you're new to us, welcome. By way of a brief introduction, CSS is an international network dedicated to strengthening citizen competency by promoting liberty, prosperity, and beauty. These three timeless principles change lives everywhere and constitute our shared civilization, and we believe are necessary for human flourishing. As an international network, we pay close attention to the changing currents in politics all over the globe and are grateful to have fellows, alumni members, all over the globe who give us on-the-ground insight. In recent months, we've hosted briefings on the ongoing situation in Israel, protests in France, elections in Eastern Europe, and today we turn our attention to London. The war between Israel and Hamas has revealed a tear in Britain's social fabric that is impossible to ignore, exposing latent anti-Semitism, the loss of shared values, and serious issues in the enforcement of law and order on our streets. We've seen swastikas displayed, monuments of national remembrance desecrated, and the law has been inconsistently applied. This all happened after the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, correctly remarked that multiculturalism had failed. To discuss these issues, we are honoured to welcome Radcliffe Chambers barrister Steven Barrett and the New York Times bestselling author and senior editor of the Post Millennial, Andy Ngo. In a little bit more depth as to their biographies, Steven Barrett read law at Oxford University and taught law at Cambridge. He practices law in a range of areas, both domestic and international. And if you follow him on Twitter, as I do, you will know that he has been outspoken in calling out the misrepresentation of the law by our police force in response to the recent pro-Palestine protests. Andy Ngo is an independent journalist and photographer and lives under threat because of his reporting and expertise on American Antifa. His seminal book, Unmasked: Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, is a New York Times bestseller. He has testified before the US Congress and has appeared on countless television shows and podcasts all over the world. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you to all of our audience who are here today. Following remarks from Andy and Steven, we will move to our Q&A, and I encourage you to submit your questions throughout using the Q&A feature on your screens. If you can't see where that is, there are three dots in the corner of your screen where it says more. If you click on that, you should see the Q&A feature. It's distinctly not the chat. So without further ado, Andy, if you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Emma. I appreciate it. And thank you to Steven Barrett for sharing the stage with me, virtual stage, excuse me. So people who have heard of me, familiar with my work, are probably familiar with me because of my protest coverage that I've done in the US for several years, predominantly in 2020, covering Antifa and violent far-left movements in the United States. I come from Portland, Oregon, where in 2020 it sustained the longest months of rioting in the United States after the death of George Floyd. And from my on-the-ground undercover observations there and my research and writing years prior, I wrote a book about Antifa, and in it, I argue that there are fringe elements on the far left that have been increasingly moving more and more into the mainstream because they latch themselves onto mainstream causes and make themselves palatable to the mainstream left, the mainstream media, Democrat politicians, left-wing politicians. And the effect of that is that their violence is no longer seen by critical mass as violent extremist activity, but rather righteous reactions to what they view as unjust. Fast forward 3 years from that, we're seeing in the United States and other places in the West some similar tactics being repeated for now the current cause, which is being branded under pro-Palestinian rights or other names that they're using. The coalition that I've observed developing includes somewhat strange bedfellows on the surface, but not really if you look into it a little bit further. So at the forefront, you have, of course, Palestinian nationalists. They may or may not be of first or second generation Palestinian Arab heritage. You have Muslims of a number of different ethnicities. You have people on the center left, mainstream left, I would say, and then you have the fringe radical left. This coalition currently we see has been manifesting themselves since the 7th of October in various forms of demonstrations, both lawful and unlawful. What I've observed in London in my coverage, and I'm going to play some videos, is that for my to my American eyes and ears, what stood out is the role of religion. It's in these demonstrations, and by religion, I'm talking just about Islam. And that brings a different dimension to the protests than we've seen in prior mass movement demonstrations like BLM or anti-fascism or anti-Trumpism. And I'm just gonna play some video, then I'll give some of my analysis and commentary. One second, I'm just pulling it up. Okay. All right. So this is a video that I recorded in Whitehall, London. So for those who are not from the UK, Whitehall is really the center of British democracy. You have Big Ben is not too far from where I was standing when I was recording this. So there are iconic things. 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister's residence is, Parliament, of course. So all of that is in this area, and most of the street was occupied at a October demonstration here. And just listen to the audio I'm going to play. Okay, so and then I'm gonna play a second clip. Actually, I'll stop that one right there. So the significance of that scene, which has been repeated over and over at all these demonstrations, is so you may have heard they were shouting Allahu Akbar, which is something you hear a lot, and they were also repeating the Islamic faith creed statement. I think these two statements being featured predominantly and often at these demonstrations around the world is pretty significant, because the protest is no longer now about a geopolitical issue involving a conflict in the Middle East. There are those who explicitly view this as a religious matter. And in the second video I'm going to play here, you'll see that very explicitly on the streets of London. So this was a demonstration in October in Mayfair, London, central London, by Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a Islamist international organization. It's a radical political Islam group. They're banned in almost all the Arab countries. They're banned in Germany because their goals are explicitly to foment revolution for the cause of Islam, overthrowing governments with the ultimate goal of reestablishing a caliphate.
Muslim armies is in time! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Muslim armies is in time! Muslim armies is in time! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Lebek! Lebek!
Yeah, so with these videos, we are dealing with something quite different here now that people have brought in religion and is making this conflict that's playing out between Hamas and Israel into essentially a religious war, and it's playing out on the streets of the West and in London. And I look forward to the questions from the audience about what I've been witnessing and my further thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Stephen, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. I really shouldn't be here. I'm a commercial barrister, and I thought I devoted my entire life to the law. The reason that I'm a commercial barrister, by the way, is very simple. Criminal law is one module. We study it at my university in our first term, and it's 8 weeks long, and then it's done. Commercial law is made up of so many modules I did, and then modules I never read. So it's just more law. And anybody who knows me and my personality and has seen me talking in public will know that I am standing for law. I see myself as a voice for the law as it got battered and bruised by people who wish to use it to achieve what I perceive as cheap political ends. Although that in itself is a political statement. I had to work out what the definition of politics is because no one else seemed to care. And still no one else seems to care. But there we are. I'm here and I exist. And I sit and I watch what's going on. And these marches are absolutely outrageous. As well as what I do for my profession, in my spare time, because you can never get enough law, I do constitutional law scholarship. And my dad's a legal academic. And I asked him years ago, can I call myself a constitutional scholar? And he looked at me, he considered it seriously and said, well, you read all of the articles, you read all of the books, you think about it a lot, so I think you can. So ever since my dad said I can, I call myself a constitutional scholar as well, because I feel that that's a justified position. I can tell you that our constitution, which is roughly 800 years old, if it hates anything, it hates riot. That's the worst thing, because often you ask young people and children, what's the worst crime? And they might pick murder and they might pick rape. And there's lots of political arguments for which one is the worst. Actually, when I was a young child, I picked stealing from your own family. I felt that had a moral dimension, but I was a weird child. The Constitution cares about riots. Maintaining the king's peace is the primary function of the state, making sure that there is no riot. And basically, this is because it's a massive reaction to the French Revolution. So everything that is happening on the streets is really contrary to the Constitution, because I don't know if anybody watching this has watched one of the marches in person, but I walked through one of them in order to talk at an event. I got hit in the face with a flag. I mean, I've seen them go. This is not orderly. This is not a demonstration. This is well beyond the line. And I sat there having experienced all this, and then I watched the Metropolitan Police Commissioner say, oh, well, the law's not clear. We don't have enough powers. This is absolute tosh. I mean, this is just gibberish. I mean, you have to be the worst lawyer in the world to not know that there are laws against all of this. Now, I have to be very careful because we also have the law of defamation. And that means I can't just point at individual acts and say, oh, you've definitely committed a crime in case I get sued. And as ever, in decent society, the good people are full of fear and the bad people have none. But I am thankful in that I'm arrogant enough or brave enough to at least tread a line and to say that this is not acceptable, what is happening. And that the Metropolitan Police ought to do something. And they are doing nothing. There was a demonstration today where children, I mean, I'm a dad, so I make no bounds about the fact that I have no rational opinion on children. I adore and will physically protect children because I am a dad. And I don't think that's from my rational mind. That's not Enlightenment values. That wasn't educated into me. That is a deep instinctive and emotive feeling, and I will protect kids. And these kids are quite clearly being misused in order to be political pawns. They're quite clearly being pumped full of hate, and we do nothing, and we do absolutely nothing to protect them. This is absolutely absurd. This is everything the Victorians would have hated. We are getting close to riot. It's coming. It's marching down the corridor slowly, and we're doing everything to bring it forward and nothing to slow it down or stop it. But the Victorians know, as I know, and as most people with common sense, so hopefully everyone here knows, you stamp on flames early on. You don't just go, oh dear, the curtains are on fire. I tell you what, let's just close the living room door and assume everything will get better. No, that's not a strategy. That's not a policy. That's not a plan. And we are in a very dangerous place because people like the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, but he believes, by the way, he will see, he must see everything I post. He's not living in some sort of cocoon land. I became aware a few years ago people are actually reading me, and I do actually get seen. So he knows I'm saying everything. In order to do what he's doing, he must have convinced himself, as humans do, that he's clever and that what he is doing is intelligent, and that this, by fanning the flames, he will somehow put them out. And that is simply wrong. I'm a very nerdy individual. I've got 10,000 years of human history. We can go through it if we've got time. Every time humans make this mistake, it gets worse. And so we are at a point where we really need to say no, which I'll just end now because I've been a bit waffly. But there are two, because I speak for a living, I spend a lot of time worrying about how I sound and planning and trying to sound interesting and be interesting. And as a young man, I listened to everything Churchill said, and I mean everything. And there is a speech from 1933 where he calls it the George and the Dragon speech, and he mocks what the world would do if there were a dragon. And he says, well, they'd have a summit and it would be a round table meeting. And he mocks everything about international law and NGOs. And he ends by saying we would certainly give the dragon a great deal of money. Well, Hamas is our dragon, and we've given it a great deal of money. And we've had roundtable discussions with it, and now it's marching on our streets, and it is time. And so because I promised you two, those of you who are savvy, the second Churchill speech is that he said when Alexander conquered Asia, he remarked that the peoples of Asia would never be free because they had not learned to say the word no. That's the word we have to say now. That's the word we have to drum into the head of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. No, Commissioner. No, officer. No, these people cannot march. No, these people cannot do that. No, they cannot hold that banner. No, they cannot use the child that way. We're going to have to rediscover the word no. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for absolutely nailing it there. So I'm going to start by asking a quick question to Andy about those videos that you showed us. There was other footage that you filmed yourself of people shouting "Kaiba Kaiba Ya Yehud," which is a sort of almost like a war chant referring to the slaughter of Jews by Muhammad's armies. And there were all sorts of incidents like this with people making reference to jihad, the police seeming to excuse that by sort of using Weasley words and sophistry and sort of wiggling their way out of having to enforce the law. I know that when, Andy, you and I first met years ago now, I was working on Islamism. It was an area that you were very interested in. Obviously, since 2017, 2018, things have changed somewhat. But it would have been very difficult to imagine then that people would have been able to stand on our streets. An organization like Hizb ut-Tahrir, as you said, they are banned in many countries around the world, talking about Muslim armies, and the police simply standing by and doing absolutely nothing. So what is your take on, having been there in the flesh, watching people chanting these sorts of anti-Semitic and pro-jihad slogans, while the police are trying to claim that, of course, they only mean jihad in a spiritual sense?
I'm going to show a couple of videos first that demonstrate sort of the variety of what has happened in the 7 weeks of protests. So on the one hand, you have there have been things that are lawful, for example, people marching and holding banners and chanting. And then you have, on the other hand, so some of the disorder that normally comes out at night, quite predictable. People will divert from where they're supposed to be on a march route and start taking over streets and confronting the public. So I'm going to show one clip that happened right next to Trafalgar Square. An elderly couple in a car that were confronted by a mob and had their vehicle hit.
No, he's gonna run them over.
We don't want to be like negative.
I didn't hear him.
So what concerns me about these type of protests is that as American-style demonstrations start becoming a bit more normalized in Britain, is that you're going to have more incidents of where people feel empowered to take over streets and to stop people from driving. In America, it seems like what we just saw would actually be considered very mild, like eyewitness. When I was there, one person hit the car with the stick. But other than that, the tires weren't slashed, the windows weren't smashed up. And by American standards, this would actually be considered a peaceful resolution. But I think what that demonstrates is in America, so often what will happen is the cars will get smashed up, people will jump on the windows, break out the windshields, slash all of the tires. I mean, there's even been some incidents where shootings have happened where drivers have been confronted in the US. And unfortunately for Americans, that is now sort of our baseline. And it speaks to sort of the power of what these protests and demonstrations are able to normalize in society. In America, we now just accept that if you're driving and you come across a protest path, you might get attacked. And I'm afraid of that happening in Britain. You spoke about political Islamism. I'm going to pull up another video that was recorded in Whitehall by another individual. I did not record this one, but it's very, it illuminates a lot of some of the other issues that we're dealing with here. So these type of videos demonstrate the importance of citizen journalism and independent journalists to capture these type of moments that provide a fuller picture of what's happening. Because if you watch the news packages that on BBC, ITV, Channel 4, you get something that's much more sanitized. You get like sort of drone footage of the huge crowds, and then you don't get a sense of actually what's happening on the ground. And another thing is some of the more extremist chants are done in another language, usually Arabic. And what he was saying whilst holding that black flag, which has the Islamic faith creed on it, which many jihadist groups and extremist Muslims use as a symbol of jihad, he was shouting Dawat al-Islam, which means the Islamic State. He was calling for Allah to curse kuffar. You may have heard that word. Kuffar is infidels. And also you may have heard Yahud, which is Arabic for Jews, and he's calling for Allah to curse Jews. So this is what's happening in parts of the demonstration. And, you know, I make it a goal to go out and demonstrate, to record these things with little commentary so that people can just see what's happening. It's an extension of what I was doing with the Antifa demonstrations in the far left, BLM demonstrations in the United States in previous years, because it's really easy to brand, for example, what I write or what I tweet as like lies or spin, but the videos can speak for themselves.
Thank you, Andy. Steven, we've got two questions here that I think tie into each other nicely. And you already mentioned the Met Commissioner and his bizarre statements about their inability to make arrests when there are all sorts of offences, as you've pointed out yourself, that they could have arrested them for, particularly in that incident where they were climbing all over a war memorial. And you've mentioned the various ways in which they could have actually enforced the law. So we've got a question here about, to what extent the Met's remarks were correct. I'd like to tie that, or the Met Commissioner's remarks were correct. I'd like to tie that into another question about jihad and other various tweets and statements that have been made by the police online, the way in which they have been engaging with the public, which I personally find extremely unprofessional. It's like a teenager has taken over their Twitter account. And one of the questions here to tie into that is whether calls for jihad on our streets should be tackled with the full force of the law, because of course there will be some people who will say this is just free speech. So what actually is the law on this? How far can the police go? What decisions are they taking operationally in withholding in the way that they have been? Because as we've seen, there have been other protests recently where they did actually then go ahead and enforce the law when it seemed like it was more politically expedient for them to do so.
Yes, well, that is the key issue, because if the Metropolitan Police is not applying the law consistently, then they become politicians, and they are now doing politics, and that's the very definition of what it is. And I want to explain what law is and why that's true, because the first question you asked me, I had a sort of, oh, rubbish, I hope that's not the whole of my question, because the only answer was yes. And that's what happens with law, because law has yes, no answers. Law is a win-lose operational system. It is yes, no, black, white, yes, bum, 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 bum. And a lot of society now over the last 30 years, because there's been a great belief in the virtue of compromise, and immediately the people who are obsessed, who are, because I think there's such a thing as extremist compromise, but the extremist compromisers, the minute you mention that compromise may not be perfect 100% of the time, will sort of jump on you and say that you're some sort of massive political extremist. So I hope everybody knows I'm not some sort of massive political extremist, but very few political extremists, sit in comfy jumpers, chatting in a calm way. But you can't compromise everything. You can't have a win-win conclusion to everything. Sometimes things conflict, and we're seeing this in other bits of society. Human rights conflict with other human rights, and that's true. And if you find a politicized lawyer, they'll tell you that they don't. And that's how I know. That's how I can sit there and spot them and go, oh, you're one of them. You're one of the political. You've given up. I've got friends on Twitter, by the way, I just want everybody to be absolutely clear, who are completely the opposite of me on politics. I'm in furious agreement with one of them today on law, because we will put aside our politics and do law. And there are lawyers who have all sorts of political opinions and none, who will put aside politics and do law. That I'm not claiming some sole virtue when I do it. But it is different from a sort of negotiation, from a win-win outcome, from a situation of trying to make people happy. We're not trying to make people happy. I don't care. It's just not. And what we've lost that with the Metropolitan Police. It wants to make communities happy. It wants to please everybody. It wants to not offend the many, and doesn't really give a toss about the few, because the many thus care. That's the descent into mob rule. That's where we're going. Because the reason the first question was so simple is, do the police have power to stop this? Yes. Easy. It's not very tricky. It wouldn't trouble an undergraduate very, very long to answer that question. It's obvious. I mean, if you haven't studied any criminal law, I suppose you wouldn't know. But a police officer who's been in the job a year would know that. That's so basic. How the Metropolitan Police Commissioner can have the sheer chutzpah to go on national television and say, I need more legal powers. You've got bucket loads, mate. Just to be clear, the police used to bring prosecutions on their own, and we didn't used to have a requirement for degree in police officers. So we literally had to structure the criminal law so that it was so simple that they could use it. And we've given them loads of powers. The Victorians were like, yes, give them every power under the sun if it prevents riots. You know, they were so obsessed with riot. They were like, yeah, sure, just give them more powers, give them more powers. And all we've done in the history of the criminal law is give them more powers. And occasionally we codify. So we have something like the 1984 Public Order Act, which is one of the ones that's got loads of these powers in. Now that's just, all that's done is like turn a load of pamphlets into a book. We've just brought a load of powers. It's not one power, it's loads of powers in one easy to find space officer, so that when somebody's climbing on a war memorial, you can arrest them. And the first, I was cooking and I was irritated watching this scene of these idiots trample on, I was particularly animated because they were standing on poppy reeds. And I'm terribly sorry, this is a political opinion, but I mean, I kept very upset about trampling on poppy reeds, and the police were saying, oh, we couldn't arrest them. It's like, well, and I just tweeted outraging public decency, and the reason I did that is because that was what the last person who desecrated a war memorial got prosecuted for. And it seems to me outrageous to prosecute people for outraging public decency and then to simply say, oh, well, we don't have any power. They always have additional powers. There's loads of extra powers. I can go through them all. I did a specky article where I hyperlinked to loads of them just to call them out. Just go, what about these, officer? And on the Met Police account being childish, I mean, it removed me as a follower, which I thought was particularly cheeky, because I have no shame, because again, I'm representing law, so I'm representing win-lose. You know, when I'm in public, when I go on something, or when I do particularly Twitter, which I take very seriously as a lawyer, I'm either right or wrong. So it's quite risky, because I'm not God. I might be wrong one day, and some lawyer might come along and go, oh, Steven, actually, and I'll have to sit there going, oh, and then I'll have to say, I was terribly sorry. Well, hasn't happened yet, but you know, touch a wood, but one day it could happen. But because I'm doing win-lose, I can be quite cheeky. I can send tweets to the Metropolitan Police going, no, you do have powers. You know, yes, you do. And I will, and I'll tag them in. I have no shame in this. Why can't I'm not wrong. If I was wrong, I'd have shame. And maybe we'll get to shame-based control, because I think that's an interesting element of the discussion. But I probably waffled on a bit for what was really a very simple answer. But yes, they have legal powers, and yes, they should use them. Oh, jihad. Yes. Now, I just muted myself. When the Home Secretary say that was unlawful, I'm pretty sure it's unlawful. Most of these things that they're saying is unlawful. If they prosecute some of them, then they'll go to court, and then we'll get a court ruling. We can appeal that court ruling if it's complete gibberish, which it probably will be in criminal law at the first instance. Honestly, those courts are just rubbish. But once we get it before an appellate court, a serious judge, we'll get rulings on these things, and then we'll know. But that process isn't happening because the Met has simply decided that it has expertise. And that's wrong. Maybe we'll also get onto Platonism, because I think that everything that's going wrong is from Plato. Everything that's good in life is from Aristotle, and everything that's bad in life is from Plato. Anyway,
I agree with that. So for a very brief answer before I put one of these questions to Andy as well. When you initially put that tweet out, pointing out to the Met that they were wrong and that there were, in fact, things that they could have arrested them for, you also said that you were contacted by a number of other lawyers who gave you all sorts of other reasons that they could have been arrested, offences they could have been arrested for. And then also this seems to have pushed some MPs to come out with their own examples of even recent legislation that could have been used to arrest them. And now we've seen the police arresting people for really quite innocuous tweets, or contacting people, or becoming involved with very innocuous statements or things that have been said online. So when the police come out and say, as Mark Rowley did, the Met Police Commissioner, saying, we don't have the powers to arrest them, we need more powers. That is firstly surely stepping beyond the boundaries of what the Met is allowed to do, because it's actually involving itself in the sort of legislative process by saying we need more powers, we can't use the ones we've got. And I'd like to know whether you think that's inappropriate, because it seems that they have stepped over all sorts of lines over the last 2 months. But also, my question to you is, do the police just simply not understand the law? Do the officers not understand the law? Is Mark Rowley ignorant? Because that seems very unlikely. And if not, why are they misrepresenting the law? And why did they not, as you said you would have done if you were pointed out representing the law, if you said something wrong, you'd say, I've made a mistake. The police haven't done that. But what they have done since is made arrests that they could have made on other occasions on if you were applying the law without fear and favour.
Yes, well, we live in a very thin-skinned, narcissistic society, and over-reliance, overexposure to constant win-win, constant compromise has meant that nobody's had to face confrontation. We're getting increasingly violent outbursts at court. So I practiced in the High Court, and I was in the High. Some genius decided the High Court shouldn't just be in London, which honestly I do roll my eyes about. Anyway, I was in the High Court in Bristol the other week, and we had a violent outburst. And I had to look after my lay clients, of course, and keep everybody safe and get into because there's somebody screaming and shouting and being extremely loud and noisy, and security's coming and the police are coming. But I explained to them that that's because it's very likely this is the first time somebody, if you take a human child and you never say no to it, what does it grow up to be? What does it turn into? If you've never said, no one's ever said no to you. This is the importance of no. And courts are often the first time people in our society suddenly go, well, I can't get my own way, just by crying and screaming and wailing and saying that you're making me ill, and using all of these repetitive turgid arguments that people use in order to effectively bully their way to a win-win outcome. And you can't, because courts are oppositional. Now, on the police, every serving officer knows. So I also got private messages from officers. I didn't really want to publish that, and I won't go into any more detail on that. But I would know, they know too. They are not as dim as their commissioner. Is their commissioner as dim as he seems, or what is going on? Well, if your police commissioner has fallen into politics, then you get this position, and it's very difficult to see that our Metropolitan Police Commissioner has not fallen into politics. I was bowled over by the criminal barristers who messaged me. I was really flattered. I have a congenital dislike of criminal lawyers because I don't see them as real lawyers, because I just see them as fact jockeys. I mean, because there's in any trial, there's a dispute between law and a dispute between fact, but they don't really have any disputes of law. Everybody knows what the law of murder is. Everybody knows what the burglary is, and all of these laws. They're not going to do anything interesting. They're just going to have an argument about facts, which I find very boring and unintellectual and not law. So I am negatively disposed towards criminal barristers. There is a hilarious thing which will occasionally happen when the secret barrister, and I know who he is, by the way. So I'm deeply unimpressed by him. I won't name him at all. It's a matter of personal honor, and I'm not going to be responsible when he is inevitably unmasked. But he will occasionally come at me on Twitter and say, oh, you're not a criminal barrister. And then get all of his legions of followers to go, you're not a criminal barrister. And I just sit there looking at him going, yeah, I know. I'm proud of that. That's a good thing. You know, what's that? Why is this a bad thing? But they did come and they did explain, because my criminal knowledge is often quite old and out of date. It doesn't mean that I'm not paying a lot of attention to criminal law. So it was great that they all came in and pointed out these other offences. And it just seemed it needed somebody to sort of just stand there and go, what? No. And to be honest, I consider that is the job of a barrister, because 20 years ago, I mean, I don't think I'm particularly glamorous now, but 20 years ago, I was definitely not very glamorous. And appearing sort of little county courts when there's just you, two barristers and a district judge, and you're arguing over, $5 grand, 10 grand, or something small, or I did a lot of property repossession, getting rid of tenants. It's just low grade stuff. You do realize that you're the only person in the room who can say no. And a little judge, I have an interest in corruption, and I think corruption tends to creep into little places. Very unlikely to get a corrupt Lord Chief Justice. Everybody's looking at the Lord Chief Justice. Much more likely to get human corruption in low levels. Although the Metropolitan Police Commissioner is probably proving me wrong in this theory, but there we are. Anyway, you're the only person who can say, he or she will walk in with predetermined outcome. So as a barrister and as a junior barrister, your interest is just to agree with them. All you need is, for an easy life, is just to go, yes, judge. And then you can leave early, you can get back, you get paid anyway, it doesn't matter, you're not going to get paid more if you cause a fuss. But I'm afraid I'm a pain in the proverbial. And I would just say, no, judge. And we would go and have arguments, and it would, it made my life an awful lot harder. I think I benefited from that. But this thing in society where it's so much easier to just go along with the crowd, and you're not benefiting personally, there's no gain, most people will just go along with the crowd. And I'm afraid I've just had 20 years of experience of not doing that. Which means I'm more than happy to do it with the Metropolitan Commissioner. And we do need this in society. We do need people who will just sit up and go, no. And then, I often mock myself that I'm the Dowager Countess of Grantham, but the Dowager Countess of Grantham is a necessary part of life. You need somebody to be the Dowager Countess, somebody has to know what the limits are and tell the Metropolitan Police Commissioner off if he needs telling off. And that's my duty. I think, again, I can't let this go to my head. I can't become some sort of awful, thing that sort of, it can't be about me. It has to be about me serving the law, which is where I draw my own limits, or try to.
Andy, Stephen mentioned in his introductory remarks that we just simply need to say no. We've got a question here in the chat about your comments in relation to the sort of potential for the proliferation of violence. You mentioned that in America, what we saw here would be considered relatively mild. And so this question that has been sent in, as well as saying no, being a necessity, they've asked what happens if that doesn't work? Can this conflict be dealt with peacefully? And do you think that the police are actually capable of dealing with this situation? What is actually at stake if we don't handle this correctly, let's say?
I think because of your legal structure being the way it is, and you having legislation that can restrict speech in a way that cannot be done in the United States, I think the police do have the tools to be able to respond in a way that police departments in the United States have been quite crippled. So there have been dozens and dozens of arrests related to the pro-Palestine protests and demonstrations and some riots. And many of those who have been were initially arrested on suspicion of incitement to some type of incitement offense. Racial hatred usually was one of them. Eyewitness, for example, at a recent Hizb ut-Tahrir rally, there were two Muslim women who held signs in Arabic, and I had a source contact those. I had a source translate those messages, and they were essentially, they could be interpreted as calling for Muslims to take some type of direct action for the cause of Palestine, including martyrdom. So they were pulled aside by police, and I saw police question them, and they were arrested that day. I don't know if they've been charged since the initial arrest. But those type of tools that police and that your law enforcement as well as your prosecutors can use here, the US doesn't have. So, on one hand, it's a free speech argument. There are other things that are going on. I think what I see happening in the United States for quite a long time is that the First Amendment is used and exploited by extremists to radicalize and to recruit with impunity. And because legislatively there really cannot be anything that the government can do locally or federally, they've wielded that type of speech in a way to organize a lot of violence. In the UK, I don't think there are so many, there's just so many tools that your law enforcement can use and do use at times. I understand the criticisms of police that have been levied out there. I personally find it a little bit weird, for example, that their social media engagement has them opining on different meanings of what jihad can mean in the context of a militant protest where people were specifically using jihad to mean religious warfare, but the Met Police online giving opinions on how it could mean something else. I find that very weird as an American. I don't know if that's usual for your law enforcement agencies to be giving that type of opinion. But in any case, and this, we were talking, or Steven and you were talking about the climbing on the war memorials and how sacred and special memorials to the British have been misused, abused by some of these pro-Palestine demonstrators. I got video of one of them, and I wanted to play it just so people could see what had happened on the 15th of November.
He done nothing. Hey, bro. خبي وجهك خبي وجهك خبي وجهك خبي وجهك ما تخبيش خبي وجهك تعال تعال ولا امسك.
So there were no arrests that happened that evening, but I just wanted to say I was really it's nice to see that within British culture there's still enough people who hold on to the belief that war memorials and statues and such should be protected. In the US, speaking again to like how much further along Americans are on this trajectory, like for something like that, the American response is, well, at least it wasn't vandalized, at least it wasn't toppled, at least it wasn't smashed up or set on fire, because that's what happened in 2020, and it happened with impunity from city to city to such a degree that people don't even take issues really in the wider American public with sacred public monuments or memorials being destroyed. Again, it's on my view that part of the agenda of pushing further and further at every one of these direct actions is to establish a new baseline, so that in the future, and we're talking, years into the future, you do it slowly. You slowly change the tolerance that the public has for these type of extremist activities or activities that are disrespectful to the public. I'm pessimistic about the United States and where we are, but I think in Britain, there are still enough people in the public who push back when these type of things happen. And I know right now we're specifically talking about how these protests have manifested for nearly 2 months. I think the longer goal of these demonstrations is really to radicalize a whole new generation for the militant Palestinian cause, if you will. And some within that are also using religion to radicalize Muslims as well. And I think we should be concerned about that, about where that's going. The disinformation that's being spread on social media day in and day out on TikTok. And I mean, now, a number of weeks ago, some people were surprised that there were all these young people making viral social media videos of people who are really sympathetic to the actions of Osama bin Laden. That's where we're at now. And that's the power of the propaganda that is driving these demonstrations on the streets as well as online.
Yeah, I thought that was quite incredible. The response, the viral response to the rediscovery of Osama bin Laden's article, because some people had been saying that this was Israel's 9/11 moment and people weren't out on the streets celebrating after 9/11. But I do wonder whether now, under the current circumstances, after an atrocity like that, whether you would actually see people out in the streets. So we've got so many good questions in this chat. So if we can, we've got 10 minutes left, just under. So if we could keep answers very short. Steven, I want to combine two questions for you, if you could answer very briefly. Someone has asked whether this is a problem of religion versus culture, or an issue to do with the general decline in standards of behavior and discourse. And in relation to that, another question asking, how do we reverse this? How do we pull this back from the brink?
Okay, well, they are linked, because don't focus on religion, don't focus on culture. We're just a hairless, although I'm maybe quite hirsute, ape. That's all we are. We never change. And in the absence of rules, or the idea of enforcement, which is what we've effectively lived through, this idea of constant win-win outcomes. You can't tell me what to do. I will behave however I wish, even though I'm an adult. Then you start to get societal breakdown. You start to get rule breakdown, and rules are under assault. The rule of law is under very clear assault. And one of the reasons, I just pick up on something Andy said, I too am quietly confident here, which is why I'm almost a little bit cocky sometimes on Twitter, because I say things like, well, I'll stay in my law library and I'll come out when you want the rule of law again, which is quite a provocative statement, because it assumes that I will survive whatever's coming. And I am assuming I will survive whatever's coming, because I think it's going to be a damp squib. There's no reason to fall into complete anarchy that I can see. I think we'll go through something very, very bad. But it's because of the breakdown of the idea of rules. Remember, I mentioned earlier somebody with whom I disagree utterly politically, that I'm in furious agreement with today. This is a professor from Oxford on law, and he also gets it. And I think what happens here is quite interesting. I think it's happened before. Across parties, people sort of go, oh. I mean, I think there's a British thing where I reckon if you're close enough to somebody in Britain and you go to a party with them, you can, with your eyes, say, we need to leave this party right now, I don't feel safe, without anybody else knowing that that's what you've said. And you'll very quietly and very calmly leave the party before it gets violent. And I think we have a gift for it. The one I also like to bring to people's attention is what I call the shopping trolley in Waitrose. A lot of people who aren't British don't understand that if you get hit by a shopping trolley in Waitrose, you say sorry. Of course you don't mean sorry. You mean how effing dare you? What outrageous, you say sorry. If you get hit again, you say nothing. If you get hit again, you cough, or you may even tut. You may even bring out a big gun. By the 7th hit, the person who's hitting you with the trolley is dead. And they don't know why, and they'll be like, if you ask them in heaven, they'll be like, well, they said sorry. Yeah, but that's how we are. And I think we have a remarkable capacity to deal with this. I think we have dealt with rule of law assault before, and I think we will come together. But the way to solve it is to go back to rules, particularly clear rules. I am absolutely obsessed. You see me writing anything, it is an obsession with clarity of rules. I don't really care what the rule is, because that's politics. Whether the rule is that you can't have blue balls, you can only have red balls. I don't care, but that's a nice clear rule, isn't it? And I want clarity of rules back. And if we get rules back, clarity of rules, and then what follows from clarity is enforcement. There must be enforcement of rules. And this is why everything that's happening with the Met is so very, very dangerous. So much more dangerous than I think they even understand. And they've convinced themselves that they're clever. And they are what I call clever stupid. And I was raised by academics, and I'm very well aware of clever stupid. There's a lovely Orwell quote that there are things so stupid that only an intellectual will believe them. And that's very true. We must go back to common sense, rules, clear rules, and enforcement. And I think we will. I'm quietly confident.
Andy, just a closing question here, following in the same vein from what Stephen has just said. So I want to ask you, firstly, for your own, maybe this is a cheeky question to ask you to be a prophet, but knowing America well and knowing the UK and having been on the ground at protests in both countries, it feels as if we're standing at a crossroads. And there are multiple possible futures ahead of us. So I want to ask you, and this is something that's come up in a number of questions in the chat as well, so I think it's resonating with the thoughts of a few of our audience members tonight. Where could we be heading if we get this wrong? What is the optimistic vision of the future? Stephen's quite optimistic that this can be pulled back from the brink. And finally, one closing question, a practical question from someone in the group, in this Q&A chat, and I almost said group chat, is a question really about citizen journalism. So this person says that they often hear about protests after they've already happened. And so she wants to know, how do you find out about protests near you and prepare for citizen journalism?
Okay, well, answering the citizen journalism question, developing that skill of finding out when and where they're happening is, it can be challenging because you have to know which activist groups or activist individuals to follow. So it's more about doing, I guess, the research on finding out who is organizing. So if you're noticing, as a matter of fact, I guess things that have happened already, what you can do is then look back and say, okay, this event that happened yesterday or earlier today, who organized that? You can find that information because that has already been published. Then you look at, oh, they put out the flyer. Then you either keep track of the account or you follow it, because it's often, even though there are many, many groups, individuals involved in all these type of any number of demonstrations, it's ultimately the ones that are organizing regularly as a smaller group. In the UK, it's Friends of Al-Aqsa, Muslim Association of Britain, even Socialist Workers' Party. Any of these ones, you can see they're resharing a lot of the same digital flyers. So I'd start with that. And then the other question about being at the crossroads, Britain is at the crossroads in terms of how much of American-style politics will you accept your society transforming into? I was surprised in 2020 that the narratives around George Floyd and American policing and systemic racism and white supremacy and all these related ideologies and claims had so much salience in other countries where the entire political tradition is different, the race relations are different, and yet it still was able to take root to a lesser extent. But the fact that it did anyways was a bit surprising to me. So it demonstrated to me that the more that these claims, which are meant to really attack sort of the heart of British society, what your institutions, all of that, you really have to really safeguard and protect, because I mean, I think what's the reason that there's been the disorder that we see in the US now, where you can see how corrupt certain local jurisdictions can be when it comes to prosecutions and criminal justice. It's because institutions have been corrupted, and your institutions are much older. So I feel a bit more confident that people will recognize when things are changing to a degree that makes enough people uncomfortable and that people speak out about. But you can't just sit back and sort of just watch it and turn a blind eye and think that things are going to maintain. I think, for example, 14 years ago, a decade ago, people turn a blind eye to what the critical race theorists were doing on the ground about race, because we had Americans that elected Barack Obama not just once but twice. People were very optimistic about race relations in America, and then within just a matter of years, you had the Black Lives Matter movement and all the radicalism that has come out from that. And so it's just, what I say is just don't be complacent, and pay attention to what the enemies of your society are doing, because they're often very discreet.
I think that's so right, and we can't just do nothing. I mean, yourself and also the photographer who goes by the online name Ink Monocle, if it weren't for the two of you going out there in the streets and recording all of this stuff, we wouldn't know that it was happening. It wouldn't have determined, well, at least the alternative news agenda, given that the BBC have been so hesitant to do any proper reporting on this. So I think you're completely right. We can't be complacent. It's up to us to push back against this. And as Stephen was saying, we know the curtains are on fire. What sort of sane person would just close the door and ignore it while the whole house sets on fire? So I think that's something that, well, this conversation is part of that, but all of us, including all of you in the audience, and anybody who's watching this on YouTube later, we need to band together and use our respective talents and skills to try and solve these problems. And that really is what the Common Sense Society is all about. So thank you, Andy and Stephen, so much for being here with us tonight. Thank you also to our audience for joining the discussion and sending in so many of your brilliant questions. We believe these conversations are integral to our mission in promoting human and societal flourishing. So if you would like to help us build a future that protects the best of the past, which is necessary for preserving liberty, please do have a look at our website, commonsensesociety.org, subscribe to our mailing list, follow CSS on social media, check out our membership options as well. We also have a number of fellowships, and join us for any upcoming events, either online or in person, either here in London or at one of our branches in the Netherlands, Hungary, or the United States. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all again very soon.